friends, peace be with you. The talk that I'll be delivering in a while is entitled Understanding Palestine Through the Lens of Global Hegemony. It's not often highlighted that the issue of Israel and its conflict with Palestine and other countries in that region is interwoven with global politics. It is a conflict that can only be understood if we looked at the global power structure, at hegemony, who is in control of the world, and what its consequences are. This is what I'll explain in this short presentation. Whenever people talk about the creation of Israel, they mention some of the forces behind this creation. Very often, three forces are highlighted. The drive for an exclusive Jewish state called Israel that came from Jews, mainly in Eastern Europe, who wanted such a state. Number two, the creation of Israel is also seen from the perspective of Christian Zionism, which is a sort of version of Christianity linked to parts of England and certain other parts of the West. Christian Zionists wanted an exclusive Jewish state. So goes the argument. The third factor that is mentioned is the role of British colonialism in the creation of the State of Israel. We often hear how the then British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour wrote a letter to the head of the Jewish community in Europe, Lord Rothschild. And in that letter, he had said that Britain would help to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine for the Jews. The argument was that this would help to protect the Jews who were being persecuted in various parts of Europe. And if they had a home of their own, exclusive home, there would be a certain degree of security, and they would not be subjected to the pogroms, the mass killings, discrimination that had happened at various points to Jews living in various parts of Europe, including Russia. So these were the three factors that were mentioned, and I'm going to concentrate on the last, the role of colonialism in creating the State of Israel. The letter from the British Foreign Secretary at that time, Lord Balfour, to the leader of the Jews of Europe was not the trigger. It was not what was responsible for this movement to create an exclusive Jewish state. One can argue, especially with the evidence we have now, that there were quite a few groups in Britain, in particular Christians, who were already talking about an exclusive Jewish state. They had friends in high places. They had people who were members of parliament and ministers who supported this idea. And Lord Balfour's letter, in a sense, was a recognition of the influence and the growing impact of this group. In other words, it was a consequence of a sentiment that was already developing in Britain, especially in rural Britain. Now, the colonial government of Britain at that time felt the need to push for this, and there were reasons from the perspective of their colonial interests. If there was an exclusive Jewish state, and if that state was the creation of the British Empire, it was quite conceivable that that state would want to protect the interests of the British Empire. This was the thinking. The thinking was that the exclusive state would be more dependable and more reliable than the states and territories in that region, in that part of the world, in West Asia, which were in the hands of the natives, Arab populations, Iranians, others. And there was a reason why the colonial power, which had the most extensive interests in that part of the world at that time, Britain, felt that an exclusive Jewish state would play this role better than the others, because they were beginning to see the first stirrings, the expressions of anti-colonial sentiments in various countries in the region. They were becoming more and more assertive. They wanted independence. They were beginning to see that. and they were concerned. They wanted a stronger grip, a stronger hold upon that region, which they felt would come via an exclusive Jewish state, a state to which the Jewish community, because it had a very big role, the Jewish community would want that state to protect the interests of the benefactor, the nation that helped to set up that state. This was the thinking. And it's true, nationalist movements were developing at that time, towards the end of the 19th century. And the colonial powers could not be certain how these developments would unfold. There was an added reason also linked to colonial interests. Oil was discovered in some parts of that region towards the end of the 19th century. And Britain was hoping, as the leading industrial nation at that time, which of course needed oil for its development, for its economic growth, Britain was hoping that it would have a head start over the others if it could help create a state that would serve its interests in that region. So oil was also a factor in this region where three continents meet: Asia, Europe, and Africa. The only place in the globe where three continents meet. So they knew it was strategically very important, and they wanted to see how they could perpetuate their interests. So this was the colonial dimension right at the birth of Israel. It is not highlighted very often. But it became more and more apparent as time went on that the colonial factor was important. And nationalist movements that had developed, which we had alluded to, were becoming stronger and stronger. And Britain realized that it needed that sort of foothold. This came to a head during the Suez Crisis. Britain and France, the two colonial powers in that region, they wanted to gain control of the Suez Canal. Suez Canal was in Egyptian territory, and Egypt was very keen on controlling the Suez. And this led to a war, as we know, in 1956. France and Britain were on one side, and they were supported by Israel, while Egypt and some of the other countries in the region were on the other side. What is very significant is that the United States of America actually backed Egypt in the Suez crisis. That is 1956. And then, of course, we've had other events which showed where the sympathies of the colonial power lay. And the most important was, of course, in the actual creation of the State of Israel through the United Nations. It was Western dominated at that time, and the West pushed for the creation of Israel through the United Nations. They had the numbers to a certain extent, but more than that, they had power and influence. It was not just the West as we know it today. Let us not forget that Russia was also very keen on the establishment of Israel. And Russia also played a role in helping to create the State of Israel. But other things that happened also showed this link between the West and Israel. We can argue, for instance, that in the wars that took place in that region, the West, by and large, were on the side of Israel, including the 1967 war. And in all the resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly and in all the other attempts to protect the interests of Palestine, the West was by and large on the side of Israel. So that link was real, and it has a long history behind it. So we should be clear about this perspective, this background on the link between the West and Israel in the initial decades. And this went on for quite a long while, and it's still the reality that confronts us today, except that there are a couple of events, developments that we should highlight in order to show that there are changes that have taken place. What were these developments which gave the impression that changes were taking place? Let us not forget that Israel's firm hold over the West and the West's affinity to Israel, it was jeopardized to some extent every now and then by certain actions taken by Israel itself that undermined its own interests. When Israel prosecuted and persecuted the others in the region, when it treated its subject people as if they were dirt, these things give a bad name to Israel. It reached a climax in the Gaza episode recently, where a lot of Gazans were killed, We know the numbers were huge. 20,000 of them were children killed in Gaza from 1973, October 1973 onwards. And that tarnished Israel's image. Israel became a pariah state as a result of what had happened in Gaza. And we have to keep this in mind because I regard this as a major turning point. Israel's hold over the region and in Israel's close relationship with the hegemon and with the Western powers and Zionism. That was one event. The other, which is also very important and it should be seen in its context, was the recent war between Iran and the US. From all accounts, from the analysis we've seen from various quarters, it's very clear that that war, perhaps the first war of its kind, Iran defeated Israel very clearly. And that was a major factor because it meant that Israel and the United States, very important nuclear powers, dominating that region, and Israel dominating in a certain way, and of course the United States backing Israel to the hilt. Many people thought that Israel, backed by the US in cahoots with Israel, they were an unbeatable combination, invincible. No one could defeat them. But then this happened. Iran defeated Israel and the US. And even though the Western media doesn't want to talk about this, but that was what had happened. And it has sort of changed the situation in the sense that people have become a little more confident that the superpower can be defeated, that Israel can be tamed. And we can go on arguing that this dent on their military superiority, their supremacy, added to the very negative image of Israel and of the United States as the main backer of Israel, that these things have strengthened the movement for a genuine independent Palestinian state. Let's keep in mind that most of the nation states of the world, most of the people of the world support this idea of an independent, self-reliant, sovereign Palestinian state. The problem is the United States and Israel. But does this mean that changes are about to take place? One, because of the military situation, the situation involving security in the larger sense. And number two, because of the image of Israel in particular, but also the United States to a great extent. Perhaps these portend changes. We may not see them in our lifetime, but they may lead to a major, major transformation. And it convinces me yet again that the only way in which Palestine and the Palestinians would regain their independence, would be able to restore their dignity, would be able to play their rightful role within the Committee of Nations, is if Western hegemony led by the United States comes to an end, because that's what protects Israel. That's what allows this injustice to continue. If that comes to an end, then I think that injustice will also be undermined or eroded to such a large extent that Palestine would be able to assert its independence. But things don't happen by themselves. People have worked towards it. And this is where I think the people of the world come in. They should stand up, they should speak, they should mobilize, they should network, they should be able to hasten the process. Not enough has been done. And even the global south, they have been quite weak in trying to bring about this change. But I think we should create a situation where they would stand up and they would be in the forefront of the struggle. And then we will have an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. We will have a situation where one of the greatest injustices known to humankind would have been brought to an end.